one ever done. Got a brain like bubblegum, blowing up my cranium. Yeah.
Hello, you're watching TVP World and I'm your host, Jonasz Rewiński. So you may be wondering, what was this all about? A singing HIMARS and some Shiba Inu dogs? Well, let me explain. Ever since the war in Ukraine began, the response of internet users has been tremendous, and the clash of narratives over who is responsible for the conflict was almost as intense as the war itself. Later on, a particular breed of internet humor has emerged, with users from across the world forging an alliance of their own. Today, we dive deep into the meme war on Putin and his vatniks by certain fellas. And Edward Hunter Christie, former NATO official, shall join us to be our guide. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So, of course, as a former member of NATO, you'll probably also be able to explain what is NAFO. That's a very different organization there, and there are many, many things to unwrap for those who are not familiar with this particular type of internet humor and comedy that we're seeing. So, for starters, who are the fellas?
Well, the fellas, or NAFO or NAFO, is basically a decentralized voluntary collective of people who've decided to take the fight to the enemy in the rhetorical space, in the space of narratives and memes on social media, notably on Twitter, but not only. And they all have little mascots that are based on a particular breed of dog. And they have a lot of humor, and they challenge Russian propaganda. They challenge Russian officials when they make, which is often the case, when they make false or misleading statements. And this naturally generates memes of their own each time the Russians try to answer. So there was a very famous incident in which a Russian ambassador actually talked directly on Twitter to one of the fellas from NAFO.
Indeed,
and said,
I mean,
you
this
pronounce this nonsense.
Yes,
not
this
me.
sparked this popularity. The mainstream recognition was Mikhail Ulyanov, who was known for spreading Russian propaganda, and he became entangled in a skirmish with the fellas and lost, apparently. And you've mentioned this phrase, you pronounced this nonsense, not me. I mean, this has become a classic, didn't it?
Exactly, indeed. And it's now a great favorite, not only of those who self-describe as fellas, but also of other experts and observers of what is going on in Ukraine and in the region. And it's become a favorite catchphrase.
Yes, and of course, it does have some more serious implications too, including fundraising, right?
Yes, so there is at root a connection with the Georgian Legion and fundraising for Georgian volunteers, as well as, generally speaking, encouraging other forms of fundraising to help the war effort in Ukraine.
And the response of the ambassador, because we've already mentioned that, he started to respond to all those people trying to undermine his narratives. He essentially broke one of the main rules of internet behavior. But also, this points towards quite a few things, right? So, for starters, Russian propaganda will only go as far if it is unchallenged. But this humorous way of actually debunking all these myths and fake news which are being spread by Russia, it seems to be working fairly well, at least in the West, in the countries where this particular type of social media humor is something that has become commonplace already.
Yes, and I mean, it's also something really quite clever that they've done, because I think many viewers may be aware of the fact that our governments sometimes also publish debunking of Russian myths and so on, and that has a certain validity, a certain effect, but nonetheless it's a bit limited. The other thing is that individual users of social media can also try to disagree with Russian propaganda, but then that's just one voice or one account among many others. But the fellas have a sort of collective identity, and there's many of them, and they can recognize each other, and others can recognize them because they use the same hashtags and they have similar symbols. And so it looks like it's really a group of people, like more like a movement. And also the fact that they use humor is an absolutely wonderful idea. It's a different approach to try to point out the flaws in the arguments of the Russian state.
So in the end, the Russian ambassador was chased away by a pack of cartoon dogs, and his mistake was trying to engage in a discussion with them, of course, but also not having the right, one could say, intellectual apparatus, since he didn't really seem to understand what this sort of internet activity is all about. I mean, he was convinced that he is actually speaking to bots, and he was trying to prove to everyone that it's in fact some sort of malicious artificial intelligences that he is actually engaged with during these exchanges, right?
Yes, quite possibly. And it's also a general philosophical point for anyone who knows dogs. It's one thing to challenge one little dog. It's quite another to challenge a pack of 25 of them. And so there was also, he got into an unfavorable dynamic, one could say.
And with these Shiba Inu avatars being one of the identifying features, there's plenty of content being created spontaneously by internet users. We actually have one example here concerning the fate of a certain Russian warship. Let's take a look at that. So there you go, a clear reference to the Titanic. Not sure if the hairstyle on this particular cartoon dog was supposed to emulate that of the character in the film, but still, you've got that. Of course, when it comes to the artistic performance and essentially playing out of tune, it's on me. We've chosen that deliberately, so if anyone complains about butchering this melody from the film, there you go. But this actually points towards a greater phenomenon, doesn't it? I mean, Russia is using certain patterns to spread information. Indeed, for quite a while, it was trying to cover up the incident involving the Moskva warship and the fact that it has heeded the Snake Island wisdom, so to say, essentially ending up at the bottom of the sea. So what does this tell us about the way Russia tries to communicate with people who are willing to listen? And there are many people still willing to listen to Russian propaganda, unfortunately.
Well, the Russians in the contemporary period are basically using a combination of old Soviet techniques and updated methods for the internet age. But essentially, the goal of disinformation is to inject false information into the information system of the enemy. That's the fundamental goal. And there's a range of techniques, some of which are quite old, so you can use forgeries or fake documents to try to give incorrect information to decision makers even. But you can also have journalistic takes that are incorrect, that are deliberately misleading. And then in the age of the internet, the other thing that happens is the mass spreading of false narratives, of false cover stories, and it becomes just a ton of noise, a ton of cynical takes, of cynical criticism against our own governments. And whenever Russia does something and is caught out, and most people understand that Russia did something it shouldn't have done, that all of a sudden you're faced with multiple narratives. Some of them will say it wasn't Russia anyway, maybe it was the Americans, the CIA, or who knows, whatever crazy theory. But then you'll have it at the very same time other stories that will say, yes, it was them, but it was some out-of-control elements from the regime, as if Putin didn't really control his people. So you have this sort of mass spreading of false narratives, and Russia uses trolls to a considerable degree. They even pay people It's their day job to basically impersonate other people online, to have fake online persona, and then just to go on social media and the whole day, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, typing away all sorts of comments, following instructions. And so they've been doing that for quite some time and quite effectively. And NAFO is, in a sense, a response to that. And it's not just simply a symmetrical response with a bunch of trolls, or a bunch of elves would be a nicer name to call those on our side. But this is more humorous, and it also has a kind of collective identity, whereas the Russian trolls all try to have different identities, and they try to pretend to be people in our own countries, for example. You might have someone pretending to be from Texas, actually it's some guy sitting in St. Petersburg being paid to impersonate a Texan online every day.
No, indeed. Sometimes the poor translation will give them away, but they are becoming increasingly sophisticated, unfortunately. So, of course, you've got trolls, you've got elves, you've got the fellowship of the ring, one could say, if we want to use a Tolkien reference here. But as you said, Russia is using various methods. They will try to push plausible deniability to its limits, as in saying, we didn't fire the Kalibr missiles which hit the seaport of Odessa. Problem is, nobody else could have done that. But there is also the question of this whataboutism being used in the media, that Russia immediately tries to undermine the given argument, saying, well, yes, but somebody else did something else in order to pretend like it exonerates them from what they do, because there were some other reprehensible deeds in distant past, for example, or other actions which are not actually that bad at all, but Russia is trying to paint them in a way that some people will just believe that they were.
Yes, indeed. And whataboutism is really a key word, I think, for all viewers to look up, because it is an absolutely central element of Russian disinformation. And my pet theory on that is that it deliberately exploits a certain aspect of the Western mind, which actually derives from Christianity, which is the idea under Christianity that you shouldn't be a hypocrite. You should not criticize your brother before you have cleaned up your own act. And that's normally a virtue. But the Russians know, or Russian propagandists know, that people in Europe and North America tend to apply that sort of rule of thumb. And therefore, whataboutism, meaning you accuse me of something, I don't actually answer your accusation, I immediately accuse you of something else. I'm both trying to change the subject, but I'm also exploiting your ethical instinct, which is to say, oh, maybe I did something wrong, maybe I need to look at myself. And then the propagandist wins the battle. So that's really what whataboutism is.
And they are also hijacking certain narratives. This happened with Sergei Lavrov, for example, criticizing the Western woke culture and saying that it is becoming difficult for ordinary conservatives to live in Western countries, as if Russia actually was a real conservative country. In fact, it is not. But then there are also these outrageous theories, like recently, that Ukraine is winning against Russian forces in the special operation, as it is called, because allegedly there are some super soldiers, mutants, created by biolabs, which are operated by the CIA in Ukraine. I mean, this is something else altogether. We haven't seen that before, but now why are they using such ham-fisted efforts if they have already mastered the more sophisticated means, such as using whataboutism as this sort of rhetorical figure?
Well, I mean, there are multiple audiences inside Western countries. And of course, Russian propagandists know that there are segments in our populations, notably in the United States, but not exclusively, where sort of slightly paranoid narratives about what our own governments are up to, what the CIA or the Pentagon might be up to in some sort of secret research program. Those are extremely popular ideas in American popular culture. There's many TV series and movies and books about this sort of thing. And the Russians know this. And so this is something that they can try to exploit. They can try to exploit, let's say, the more suspicious-minded, somewhat paranoid, if I may say, elements of society by saying, yeah, it's probably some secret American government lab. It's not us. It must be something sinister they are doing. And don't you know they do sinister experiments? I mean, you have a whole industry of people who trade stories in alien abductions or aliens visited the Earth and the Pentagon covered it up and things like that. This whole TV series, like the X-Files back in the 1990s, which was an extremely popular TV series, made a lot of money by that. And so I think the Russians are quite keen observers of the sorts of memes that go through our societies, and they try to plug into them.
Indeed. I mean, back in 2014, there was an example of a more recent cultural trope being exploited, not successfully, by one of the leaders of so-called Russian separatists, who claimed that the MH17 crash was in fact a hoax, and he used a plot point from BBC's Sherlock, where a plane was flying somewhere with people on board who are in fact dead, and he claimed that this wasn't in fact the case. Of course, it was immediately debunked by people who knew where this particular talking point came from, but still it shows how they are trying to exploit our popular culture, not always successfully. Still, we have covered plenty today. Hopefully this will encourage people not to accept Russian propaganda as it is, without reflection. So don't be a vatnik, be one of the fellas. This is something that should be our main takeaway from this conversation. Edward Hunter Christie was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, and we are NAFO.
Absolutely. And you're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news and updates.